In Death of a Generation, history professor Howard Jones considers the impact that the assassinations of U.S. President Kennedy and South Vietnamese President Diem had on the Vietnam War. This History on Book TV feature from the National Archives in Washington, D.C. lasts an hour.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the National Archives. My name is Sam Anthony, and I'm your host for tonight's lecture and book signing. We are honored to have with us Dr. Howard Jones as he will discuss his book, Death of a Generation, How the Assassinations of Diem and JFK Prolonged the Vietnam War. Dr. Jones comes to us all the way from the University of Alabama. After teaching at the University of Nebraska for 2 years, he went to the University of Alabama in 1974, where he is now the University Research Professor of the Department of History, a recipient of both the John F. Burnham Distinguished Faculty Award for Teaching and Research and the Frederick Moody Blackman Sarah McCorkle Moody Award for bringing recognition to the university. He teaches courses in American Foreign Relations and the U.S. Vietnam War. Dr. Jones has spent many an hour here at the National Archives and in the JFK Presidential Library and the LBJ Presidential Library researching this book. And you can do that too. The National Archives has billions of records, whether it be textual documents, photographs, motion pictures, and whether it was cited in this book or not, you can come here to the National Archives yourself and carry out your own research. So if you'd like to learn more about the National Archives, our programs, our records, ask me some questions. My information is in the program, or go to our website at archives.gov. Well, let's not stop anymore. How about I introduce to you Dr. Howard Jones. He comes all the way from Tuscaloosa, Alabama, and by the way, he received his PhD from the University of Indiana. It gives me great pleasure to introduce to you Howard Jones.
I thank you very much for coming out this evening, and I thank Sam for having me here at the National Archives. It's always a wonderful occasion to come to this place. If President John F. Kennedy had lived, he would not have sent combat troops to Vietnam, and America's longest war would never have occurred. So say Kennedy apologists. His assassination on November 22nd, 1963, they insist, had killed more than the president. It was responsible for the death of a generation, of more than 58,000 Americans, along with untold numbers of Vietnamese on both sides of the 17th parallel. When I began this study, I was dubious about these assertions, but as my research progressed, many of my doubts disappeared. President Kennedy had long regarded the war as South Vietnam's alone to win or lose, and made every effort short of direct U.S. combat involvement to turn the verdict in Saigon's favor. He staunchly resisted the relentless pressure for combat troops that came from both military and civilian advisors, but, critically important, he never called for a total withdrawal. Kennedy hoped that American assistance would improve South Vietnam's fighting performance to the extent that it could bring the insurgency under control. By the spring of 1962, he sought to roll back the U.S. military involvement to the less provocative advisory level he had inherited when taking office more than a year earlier. By the time of the president's assassination, he had come close to finalizing a process for withdrawing most of America's soldiers in accordance with the Comprehensive Plan for South Vietnam. The recently released Kennedy White House tapes show that both he and Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara had become convinced by the fall of 1963 that the United States should start the phased withdrawal. Once the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, ARVN, had pushed back the Viet Cong, and after Kennedy had won re-election in 1964, he would continue the withdrawal program aimed at having the great bulk of U.S. soldiers home in 1965. Those remaining behind would number 1,500, all advisors and well within the strictures of the Geneva Accords of 1954. This withdrawal effort stalled in the wake of the Buddhist uprising of May 1963 and ultimately came to a halt by the end of the year. What had happened in the meantime? In a tragically misguided move, President Kennedy followed Secretary of State Dean Rusk's advice and promoted the general's coup in late 1963, thinking that a change of government would improve the war effort and thereby facilitate the U.S. withdrawal. Consequently, when the RVN generals staged their coup in early November, they did so with full knowledge of American approval. South Vietnamese Premier Ngo Dinh Diem's crude handling of the Buddhist crisis had combined with the RVN's bumbling war effort, the Kennedy administration's open criticisms of the regime, and the persistent rumors of Saigon's secret negotiations with Hanoi to drive the generals into a coup that culminated in the deaths of both Diem and his brother, Ngo Dinh Nhu. The two assassinations opened a visceral division among the coup makers and led to renewed domestic turmoil. Then, in the short span of 3 weeks, President Kennedy himself lay dead, and with him, the comprehensive plan for South Vietnam. For good reason, historians are reluctant to speculate on what might have happened in Vietnam had President Kennedy lived. It is not speculation, however, to examine his policies toward Vietnam in an effort to discern whether or not a pattern of withdrawal was in the making. Kennedy sought to halt the move toward Americanizing the war in a process that President Richard Nixon would call Vietnamization. But so deep was the Kennedy administration's involvement in these events that it could not have escaped blame for the coup, regardless of what it did or did not do. Kennedy had encouraged a coup that got out of hand and led to Diem's death rather than his exile. And yet, had Kennedy lived to win re-election, there is no reason to believe that he would have changed his views about wanting to get out of a war that had become a lost cause. The story of this policy failure begins in the spring of 1962, when the apparent progress in the war encouraged the first talk of military reductions. At a high-level conference in Honolulu on July 23rd, General Paul Harkins, the ever-optimistic commander of the Military Assistance Command Vietnam, MACV, presented a glowing report on the war which heightened the move toward partial withdrawal. President Kennedy had instructed McNamara to devise a formula for implementing the process. The ensuing comprehensive plan for South Vietnam aimed at enabling the South Vietnamese government to police its own affairs, quote, without the need for continued U.S. special military assistance by the end of 1965. Not everyone shared this confidence. In late 1962, President Kennedy's longtime friend, Senator Mike Mansfield, submitted a dismal report on Vietnam and called for its neutralization. After Mansfield left a tense 2-hour meeting with the president at his Palm Beach retreat in Florida, Kennedy moaned to aide Kenneth O'Donnell, "I got angry with Mike for disagreeing with our policy so completely. And I got angry with myself because I found myself agreeing with him." The perceived progress in the war took another jolt when two of the president's closest advisors, Roger Hilsman and Michael Forrestal, returned from Saigon to confirm many of Mansfield's pessimistic observations, and yet quixotically predicted victory, albeit over a longer period than at first thought. The CIA, meanwhile, warned against a deadly war of attrition, asserting that the Diem regime was the root of the trouble, and ominously reporting that 400 regulars from the People's Army of Vietnam in the north had just entered South Vietnam, armed with Chinese weapons. Finally, on January 2nd and 3rd, 1963, a huge RVN and Civil Guard contingent suffered what Hilsman termed a, quote, stunning defeat, end quote, at Ap Bac in the Mekong Delta, just 35 miles southwest of Saigon. For the first time, Viet Cong guerrillas had stood their ground, raising doubts about the prospects of victory. More or less beginning then, Forrestal later recalled, Kennedy began to get worried about Vietnam. President Kennedy rejected an immediate withdrawal as an admission to defeat. In the Oval Office, he admitted to Mansfield that his call for a military withdrawal was correct. But I can't do it until 1965, after I'm reelected. Otherwise, there would be a wild conservative outcry in the election campaign that would have severe political repercussions. After Mansfield left the room, Kennedy confided his intentions to O'Donnell, who had also been present. In 1965, I will become one of the most unpopular presidents in history. I'll be damned everywhere as a communist appeaser, but I don't care. If I tried to pull out completely now from Vietnam, we would have another Joe McCarthy Red Scare in our hands. But I can do it after I'm reelected. So we had better make damn sure I am reelected. In the spring of 1963, the withdrawal plan appeared to be nearing completion. On March 7, the Joint Chiefs signified approval. And on May 6th, the President's advisors met in Honolulu to draft the details. But the entire program came to a standstill just 2 days later, when during the early evening hours of May the 8th, violence erupted in the imperial capital of Wei during the nationwide celebrations of Buddha's birthday. Disturbances rapidly spread to Saigon and other cities as Buddhist monks protested against alleged religious discrimination and terrorism by Siem's Catholic-dominated government and claimed to have a mandate from heaven to launch a revolution aimed at securing religious freedom. The most spectacular event came on June the 11th, when a Buddhist monk immolated himself on a crowded street in downtown Saigon, blindsiding the Kennedy administration. "A Buddhist barbecue," Madam New acidly remarked, clapping her hands in glee and calling the protest communist-inspired. "How could this have happened?" the president stormed to Forrestal. "Who are these people?" The Buddhist crisis pushed the Kennedy administration closer to ending its support of Siem and, paradoxically, into a more tangled involvement in Vietnam. Rusk pointedly told Chargé William Trueheart in Saigon, quote, "If Siem does not take prompt and effective steps to reestablish Buddhist confidence in him, we will have to re-examine our entire relationship with his regime." The White House knew that a hardline position toward Siem could encourage a coup, and yet it took the first step in that direction by appointing Republican Henry Cabot Lodge, Jr. as new ambassador to South Vietnam. Lodge would also serve as the president's, quote, "personal representative," end quote, meaning that he would report directly to Kennedy. CIA Director John McCone believed that Lodge had private instructions from the president to warn Siem that if he failed to get rid of his brother and change his government, the new ambassador was to, quote, "use his influence to bring about a change in the top leadership," end quote. But before Lodge's arrival, the domestic crisis intensified when shortly after midnight on August 21, heavily armed government forces launched a brutal crackdown on Buddhist pagodas throughout South Vietnam. Truckloads of steel-helmeted combat police in Army camouflage uniforms joined Red Beret Special Forces in arresting more than 1,400 bonzes and charging them with possessing weapons. The pagoda raids, quote, "mark the end of the Siem regime," Lodge later remarked. Firing at people in worship made it just a matter of time before they would be through. Trueheart asserted that the White House never made a serious effort to get behind Siem again. Lodge tried to prevent any precipitous U.S. action, but his cautionary August 24 telegram arrived in Washington on a Saturday afternoon when, as fate would have it, those few advisors on duty were the most outspoken opponents of the Siem regime. Forrestal, Hillsman, and veteran hardline diplomat Averell Harriman anxiously read Lodge's account of the raids, noting that it confirmed their suspicions that New had been responsible. Indeed, New had secured Army uniforms for the government's forces, shifting the blame to the generals and thereby infuriating the group that had the greatest potential for staging a successful coup. The ensuing Telegram 243 sent to Lodge and drafted primarily by Harriman, Hillsman, and Forrestal, declared that if Zim refused to remove New, we must face the possibility that Zim himself cannot be preserved. President Kennedy realized that his approval of Telegram 243 would promote a coup, and later called it, quote, a major mistake, end quote. His brother, Attorney General Robert Kennedy, put it bluntly: the result is we started down a road that we never really recovered from. But the impetus for a coup surprisingly fizzled. The generals refused to proceed without a specific assurance of U.S. support, and that assurance never came. And yet the White House had not closed the door on fostering a coup. At a morning meeting of the National Security Council on September 6, Rusk convincingly argued that to facilitate a U.S. withdrawal from Vietnam, the administration, quote, might want to consider promoting a coup beforehand. That objective in mind, Lodge proposed that former CIA operative and now Air Force General Edward Lansdale mastermind a coup. A risky venture it was, but the full measure of the administration's desperation became clear when President Kennedy invited Lansdale to the White House to discuss the proposal. Soon after Lansdale accepted the invitation, McNamara showed up in his limousine at the Pentagon and offered him a ride to the meeting. The Defense Secretary escorted Lansdale into the room and took a chair. The meeting would be about Cuba, Lansdale must have guessed. His most recent assignment had been to head the secret program codenamed Operation Mongoose that aimed to topple Fidel Castro. The president, however, raised an entirely different matter. Would you return to Vietnam and attempt to persuade Diem to remove his brother and wife from the country? Yes, Lansdale replied. At long last, the administration had come to realize what he had known for a long time. The news were the problem, not his old friend Diem. The president had more in mind, however. But if that didn't work out, or I changed my mind and decided we had to get rid of Diem, would you be able to go along with that? A deafening silence. Although McNamara sat in the room, Lansdale could not have been aware of anyone but the president. Was he thinking exile? Lansdale must have asked himself. If so, Lansdale realized that bloodless coups were rare. He also knew that Diem would choose death over leaving his country. Was the president proposing Diem's assassination? President Kennedy's words were purposely vague in meaning, and Lansdale's long experience with the CIA had taught him never to seek clarification in instructions. No, Mr. President, shaking his head slowly, I couldn't do that. Diem is my friend. The meeting was over. The president tried to smooth over what had transpired, but his small talk did nothing to erase the pall of the underworld that had just visited the room. Lansdale would not be going to Vietnam. In the limousine afterward, McNamara angrily lashed out at Lansdale as they returned to the Pentagon. You don't talk to the President of the United States that way. When he asks you to do something, you don't tell him you won't do it. Is this story credible? According to both investigative reporter Seymour Hersh and A.J. Landguth, a New York Times correspondent in South Vietnam during the 1960s, Lansdale related these events to Daniel Ellsberg, the Defense Department official responsible for the Pentagon Papers. Both Landguth and Ellsberg believed Lansdale's story. But in an interview of McNamara conducted by Landguth years afterward, the former Defense Secretary alleged that he did not recall that meeting. McNamara's claim to a memory lapse was not surprising, for he could not remember other meetings he had attended while in office, some of which dealt with the subject of assassinations. During the mid-1970s, the Church Committee of the U.S. Senate investigated assassinations of the previous decade and asked him about Operation Mongoose. The then president of the World Bank had come under media fire for his alleged participation in a special committee discussion on August 10, 1962, regarding the assassination of Castro. McNamara could not recall being there. and vehemently denied any knowledge of assassination plans either before or during his time in office. I believe then, he told the committee, that the U.S. government should not undertake or encourage assassination openly or secretly as an instrument of national policy against people with whom we're not at war. Assassination is totally inconsistent with my moral standards now and then. The evidence amassed by the Church Committee raised serious questions about McNamara's testimony. Particularly damaging was a memo of August 14, 1962, in which William Harvey, chief of the CIA task force on Cuba, claimed that at a meeting in Russ's office on August 10, McNamara raised the question of assassination, quote, particularly of Fidel Castro, end quote. The senior administration members present were shocked that the defense secretary had used the word liquidation in a formal meeting. McCone, according to an observer, got red in the face and made known his intention to stop any such proposals, suggestion, or any discussion thereof at that meeting within that forum immediately. He and Edward R. Murrow from the U.S. Information Agency hotly declared the subject out of order, and the secretary of the meeting did not record the discussion in the minutes. McCone felt so strongly that he telephoned McNamara later that same day, stressing that he not raise the matter again. But the issue would not go away. On April 23, 1963, McNamara attended a top-level meeting where he, according to the note-taker, quote, made clear his belief that the elimination of the Castro regime was a requirement, end quote. And in mid-1975, Richard Goodwin, Latin American specialist in the State Department during the 1960s, told members of the Select Committee that at a Cuban task force meeting after the Bay of Pigs episode, McNamara suggested, quote, getting rid of Castro. When someone from the CIA asked if he meant by executive action, McNamara affirmed that he did. This brief digression from Vietnam strongly suggests a pattern in McNamara's behavior. It's difficult to believe that he forgot all those discussions about eliminating Castro. How could the defense secretary fail to recall his own recommendations for assassination? Better yet, is it likely that he would forget McCone's admonition, not once but twice, about raising the subject in formal discussions? The records show that McNamara attended many of these meetings relating to Operation Mongoose. Lansdale claimed that the secretary was present at the private 1963 conference with the president. Lansdale was devious and manipulative by trade, but it is incomprehensible that he would fabricate a clandestine meeting that tied the Secretary of Defense and the President of the United States to an assassination proposal. Evidence of the White House meeting with Fitz with other features of this sensitive period. Lodge had a direct connection with the White House as the President's personal representative, which implied a special status that could cover the exchange of delicate information. The President had approved Telegram 243, which had told Lodge that if Diem refused to remove his brother, the White House would support the elimination of the premier. Lodge was not naive. He was certainly aware of Lansdale's propensity to stray beyond his orders. It is really a pity, Lodge lamented to Rusk. Had my request been granted, I believe the coup might have been pulled off. Unknown to everyone except McNamara and Lansdale, however, the President had been willing to give Lodge's proposal a chance. If the President had doubts about the U.S. military effort, he became even more uncertain after hearing the mixed report of another first-hand inspection of Vietnam. At a National Security Council meeting on September 10, the two mission leaders presented diametrically opposed assessments of the war. President Kennedy's frustration became evident in his cryptic remark, "The two of you did visit the same country, didn't you?" The White House opted for a series of escalating pressures ostensibly designed to force governmental reform, but that it knew had the capacity to encourage a coup. To persuade Diem to make changes, President Kennedy dispatched another special mission to Saigon in mid-September. Headed by McNamara and the President's special advisor, General Maxwell Taylor, It concluded that the administration should accelerate the phased withdrawal program. On October 2nd, President Kennedy took the initial step by deciding to withdraw the first contingent of 1,000 U.S. military forces from Vietnam by the end of the year. His decision was unconditional, for he approved a calendar of events that did not necessitate a victory. Indeed, his confidant, John Kenneth Galbraith, insisted years afterward, implicit in all his conversations with the president during this pivotal period was, quote, the realization that victory was not possible, end quote. The White House approved a program of selective short-term pressures that were primarily economic and in proportion to the regime's improved performance. I think, McNamara told the president, we must have a means of disengaging from this area, and we must show our country that means. In reality, however, this step was the one most coveted by the generals as a signal of U.S. interest in a coup. The authors of the report realized this and asserted that the administration must establish contacts with, quote, an alternative leadership if and when it appears. 2 days later, Taylor, now Joint Chiefs Chair, informed his colleagues that the military withdrawal was one of President Kennedy's, quote, approved actions for South Vietnam. Robert Kennedy recommended downplaying the move by making no formal announcement and carrying out the process in a routine way. Let's just go ahead and do it, the president declared. In this highly charged atmosphere, the chances of a coup regained momentum. On October 2nd, at Saigon's airport, CIA operative Lucien Conein, codenamed Black Luigi, Lulu, wore a military uniform signifying the rank of lieutenant colonel. Conein encountered South Vietnamese General Trung Van Dom, who had been trying to contact his old friend for some time. Could they meet that night? Yes, responded Conein, not hesitating to make the 200-mile trip to a spot northeast of Saigon. In an hour-long session, Dom emphasized that the generals now have a plan. In an hour-long session, we now have a plan. Their leader, General Duong Van Minh, Big Min, wanted to meet with Conein at Joint General Headquarters in Saigon. Big Min informed Conein that a coup was about to take place and that he needed U.S. assurance of military and economic assistance afterward. In a response that William Colby, former CIA station chief and later CIA director, termed a green light to the generals, Conein followed Lodge's directive in promising that the United States would not obstruct a coup and would provide help following its success. The generals intended to leave Diem in office as figurehead, but to assassinate his brother Nhu and 2 others. If a difference existed between promoting a coup and doing nothing to stop one, that distinction was narrow, particularly since the major player on the scene was the United States. The Kennedy administration had furnished the trigger to the coup by cutting assistance to the regime and promising economic and military help to the generals once they took over the government. Furthermore, in remaining silent about Min's assassination plan, it had lost any potential control over events. In the heat of the moment, could the assassins guarantee Diem's safety? The coup erupted in Saigon during the afternoon of November 1. Men had gathered all the rebel generals in a show of strength before telephoning Xiaolong Palace at 4:45 p.m. and demanding a surrender. Nhu bitterly asserted that Diem was not there and refused to surrender. Diem had 5 minutes to resign, Min hotly retorted. Otherwise, the generals would launch a massive artillery assault on the palace. Not waiting for a reply, he slammed down the phone. Less than a half hour, he called again, asking for Diem. But the premier refused to talk with him and hung up the phone. Min was furious over this loss of face. At 7:15 p.m., he tried one last time, warning Nhu that if Diem did not surrender, the rebel forces would, quote, blast him off the face of the earth, end quote. Diem would not come to the phone. Min's colleagues expressed concern that further delay would work to Diem's advantage. Had he not risen from the ashes in 1960? Conein, invited to rebel headquarters to become part of the events, warn men, if you hesitate, you will be lost. Men had no choice but to lay siege on the palace. Shortly after 3 a.m., the assault began, ending a little more than 3 hours later with Ziem's unconditional surrender. Men arrived on the smoky scene at 8 a.m. on November 2nd in full military dress uniform and ready to supervise the transportation of Ziem and his brother to command headquarters for a prearranged surrender ceremony. According to Konin, most of the officers, including men, had changed their minds about retaining Ziem in office and now wanted him to have an honorable retirement followed by exile. Their overriding concern was to orchestrate an orderly transition in government that would win international acceptance of the coup. Men intended to personally escort Ziem and New back to headquarters where, with full press coverage, they would all sit at a green, felt-covered table while Ziem formally relinquished power to the vice president. After the proceeding, Ziem would ask for asylum in a fully broadcasted event. The generals would grant the request, stipulating that he and New remain in custody until the aircraft whisked them out of the country. None of this happened. The brothers were not in the palace. Ziem and New had fled through a subterranean tunnel and jumped into a waiting car that took them away. Humiliated before his peers, Min was livid that Ziem and New had stolen away in the night. But the worst news was yet to come. Ziem and New were dead. A little after midnight on November 2nd, the CIA notified the White House that Vietnam radio had announced their deaths by poison, taken while prisoners in an armored personnel carrier transporting them from the city to the rebel command post. Harkins, however, reported the claim of death by self-destruction, either by gunshot or by a grenade wrestled from the belt of an ARVN officer. Death by accidental suicide, asserted the generals in the face of the Catholic brothers' beliefs. Men explained in trying to clear up the discrepancy that due to an inadvertence, there was a gun inside the vehicle. It was with this gun that they committed suicide. The truth behind the two brothers' deaths began to seep out. After men had ordered a search of all areas frequented by the No family, he learned of their escape to the Chinese sector of Cologne, where they sought refuge in a Catholic church. A few minutes later, just before 10 a.m., 2 jeeps and an armored personnel carrier screeched into the narrow alcove housing the church building. In command was General Mai Hu Swong, a longtime enemy of Ziem's. Swong dispatched his men into the building to bring out the brothers. Once outside, Ziem requested a brief stop at the palace to gather personal items before his flight out of Vietnam. Swan turned him down, coldly stating that his orders were to take them to headquarters. One brash young officer asked to shoot New. No, replied Swan. New expressed disgust at Ziem's having to ride in an armored car. You use such a vehicle to drive the president? Swang angrily ordered the brothers' hands tied behind their backs and shoved them into the carrier. As he jumped into a jeep to head the convoy, Ziem and New found themselves sitting in the carrier with 2 men. Captain Duong Hu Na, who was at the turret of the armored vehicle, and Captain Nguyen Van Noom, men's personal aide and bodyguard. Noom was an assassin by trade who already had put 40 marks on his revolver. His animosity towards Ziem ran second only to his visceral hatred for New. En route to the general's headquarters, Noom killed Ziem and New. Na explained what had happened. As we rode back to the joint quarters, Ziem sat silently, but New and the captain began to insult each other. I don't know who started it. The name-calling grew passionate. The captain had hated New before. Now he was charged with emotion. When the convoy stopped for a train, Noom lunged at New with a bayonet and stabbed him again and again, maybe 15 or 20 times. Still in a rage, he turned to Ziem, took out his revolver and shot him in the head. Then he looked back at New, who was lying on the floor, twitching. He put a bullet into his head, too. Neither Ziem nor New ever defended themselves. Their hands were tied. The CIA in Saigon had meanwhile secured a set of snapshots that left no doubt of a double assassination. Taken around 10 a.m. on November 2nd, they showed the two dead brothers covered with blood on the floor of an armored vehicle, dressed in a Roman Catholic priest's robes, hands tied behind their backs, faces bloodied and bruised, their bodies beaten and stabbed repeatedly. The pictures appeared all over the world. "Suicide with no hands," read the caption in the Time magazine. The administration's dire suspicions materialized into fact when it became certain that men had ordered Noum to kill Diem and New. Konin termed the general a very proud man who had lost face. Their decision to flee was one of the things that ticked off men, and he gave the order. Testimony later from various others indicated that men alone had carried out the order. "Pretty stupid," uttered President Kennedy barely above a whisper before stunned cabinet members. Diem's assassination implicated all the generals and drove their initial harmony into rank discord. Dome abhorred the killings, caustically insisting that he and his cohort had furnished the armored car in an effort to protect Diem and New, not kill them. And yet Dome and the others failed to realize that all conspirators bore responsibility for the deaths by participating in the coup. In a similar manner, President Kennedy and his advisors likewise bore culpability. The White House had promoted the coup at its most critical moment, when its leaders needed only a nod from Washington. As Dome and all the other generals involved in the coup shared guilt for the assassinations of Diem and New, so did the U.S. government take its place as an accomplice. Admittedly, unexpected developments in the coup led to the decision to kill Diem, but as Colby later asserted, it's something that you have to anticipate may take place in the event of an overthrow of a government. In accordance with Russ's earlier argument, the administration used the coup's success to justify withdrawal. Before a press conference on November 14, President Kennedy asserted that at the scheduled Honolulu conference in 6 days, his advisors would develop detailed plans for the initial troop withdrawal. Presidential advisor McGeorge Bundy afterward drafted a national security action memo based on the Honolulu proceedings that he expected President Kennedy to sign as a precursor to withdrawal. In the late afternoon of Thursday, November 21, Forrestal spoke with the President in the Oval Office just hours before his departure for Texas. Looking to the near future, the President asserted, "I want you to come and see me because we have to start to plan for what we're going to do now in South Vietnam. I want to start a complete and very profound review of how we got into this country and what we thought we were doing and what we now think we can do. I even want to think about whether or not we should be there. I want to consider how some kind of a gradual shift in our presence in South Vietnam can occur." Just as the withdrawal plan moved to implementation, President Kennedy was assassinated on November 22nd, bringing the process to a close. His successor, Lyndon Johnson, promised to continue his predecessor's domestic and foreign policies. But in an abrupt change of direction, the new president bowed to the Joint Chiefs' wishes and revised NSAM 273 by raising the level of covert operations against Hanoi. The proposal, codenamed O-Plan 34A, led to the Gulf of Tonkin crisis of August '64, followed by an Americanized war. Had Kennedy lived, would he have pursued the withdrawal plan? Nothing suggests that he would have given up his attempt to return the military commitment to its early '61 level. Never in his 1,000 days in office did he stray from the principle that the war was South Vietnam's to win or lose. Nor, in light of the Bay of Pigs fiasco, is there reason to believe that he would have turned over the war to the Joint Chiefs. To tone down the Cold War thrust of the nation's foreign policy, the President intended to replace the hardline Rusk with McNamara as Secretary of State. The critical point is that Kennedy was willing to pull out all special military forces short of victory. The President sought to reduce the U.S. involvement, not end it. President Kennedy's central tragedy lies in his promoting a coup aimed at facilitating a military withdrawal from Vietnam. For his actions tied the U.S. more closely to Vietnam and thereby stonewalled his plan to bring the troops home. So carefully had he analyzed the risks of sending combat troops. Not so carefully had he analyzed the risks of promoting a coup. His legacy was a highly volatile situation in Vietnam that in the hands of a leader seeking a quick solution lay open to full-scale military escalation. The new president soon Americanized the war, resulting in the death of a generation. I thank you very much for your time.
We do have some time for questions from the audience. We will conclude in a little bit with our book signing, but let's go to some questions. I do know that we have some very talented students from Washington Lee High School from Arlington, Virginia. How about we start with y'all? Any questions from your group? Okay, now let's go. We'll just open up to everyone. You can jump in any time. Actually, back here. Yes, sir.
Professor Jones, I'm wondering about the participants in the coup, the generals. Are any of them still around? Were you able to talk to any of them? And were people like Tew or Key involved?
Tew was, yes. Tew was one of the generals involved in it, and he was the one, in fact, who led the siege on the palace. It's the one later, the president in 1971. The others I was not able to talk with. I believe most of them have passed on. There are a number, though, who have left their memoirs, and I was able to piece some things together from that. But, of course, that's not always...
He was not involved?
No.
Okay, we'll go to the Arlington School. There we go.
Yes.
So thank you. You started off along the same lines talking about the generals who were promoting the coup. You started off by saying that they initially wanted merely to keep Diem in office as a figurehead, but then changed their mind and wanted to have him exiled. And I was wondering, what was it that made them change their mind?
I think they were very much concerned about Diem coming back. I mean, this had happened so many times. One time, a man had run up to shoot him, and the gun didn't go off. And a couple of other times, they came so close to getting him, and it just didn't work out. And he just seemed to always come back. And I think, as a couple of people said after the deaths of them, that big men had ordered them because they were scared to death of these two, that they indeed might come back. Now, I think what they decided at this point was that they would keep the whole affair legitimate in the sense that it would be a bloodless coup. They would not kill them. They would go into exile. And according to Conein, the whole thing was staged with the press involved. Everyone was there ready to witness all of this, and then they disappeared in the tunnel.
Let's go in the very back, Dr. Rogers.
Well, speaking of Lyndon Johnson, where was Lyndon Johnson when all this was going on? What was he doing? Did he express any opinions?
Lyndon Johnson very much opposed the involvement in the coup, very strongly opposed that, but he didn't really have a voice in it. He had gone to Vietnam in May of '61 on a friendly mission, goodwill mission, as you probably know about that. But in terms of sitting in on these big meetings, he sat in on some of them, but you don't hear any voices from him. But when he did become president, he made the statement that he strongly opposed the coup.
Yes, sir. Mr. Lowen.
I think there's a paradox in your talk, and let me suggest two reasons why I think that. One is, you said, and I think this is a quote, that John F. Kennedy, that the president sought to reduce the U.S. commitment, not end it. Now, the United States is not going to make a commitment to the Ho Chi Minh government. Right. That's just not going to happen. Yeah. So when you say that President sought to reduce the U.S. commitment, you mean while the South Vietnam regime stays in power. And so the question comes up, and this is something LBJ could never figure out, and neither could Richard Nixon. How do we keep on supporting this regime while it keeps on losing the war? I mean, isn't ultimately then the president likely, had he lived, to reverse himself because his policy is a paradox?
Well, John Kenneth Galbraith, I was fortunate enough to talk with him. He's in his 90s and sharp as can be. And he indicated that, and I know that he talked with Kennedy many times on a personal level. He had been his campaign manager back in '60 and very close to him all these years. And he indicated that the whole atmosphere of the White House when he saw it during this time was that of just imminent defeat. And that the president, if he had not become convinced that defeat was coming, there certainly wasn't going to be the victory that everyone had talked about before. And so victory became defined by President Kennedy as, under Vietnamization, that you reduce the insurgency to the level that the government there would have a chance to control it. Now, would that government ever be able to control that? That's the big question. And I think what Galbraith would have said, and I know he said this and some others as well, is that they had written it off, that we were going to maintain MAG there, the Military Assistance Advisory Group, but MACV was just not going to have the high-profile role it had before. We were going to reduce it back to the way it was back in 1961 and just get out. Yeah, I know exactly what, and I've wrestled with that, sure have.
One other follow-up. You mentioned also that one of the criticisms of Diem and his regime was that he was maybe soft on negotiating. He was maybe willing to negotiate with the North. That sounds like that undercuts some of the, I mean, that's a way to end it.
Yeah, well, you mean in terms of talking with Hanoi?
Yes, and if that wouldn't work, then that's a way for us to get out of Vietnam. And that's one of the reasons we overthrew him.
Well, Frederick Nolting said, and you have to keep in mind that he was very pro-Diem. In fact, that's why he was relieved from his command, a large part of it, although there was a calendar of events that would take him out around that time anyway, but then Lodge took over. Nolting said several times that Viet Cong agents were showing up in the palace and talking with Diem and talking with New. And he strongly suggested that New was trying to negotiate something, trying to buy some time, that he was in a desperate situation at this point, that the generals were all up in arms around him, and he just decided he was going to try to buy some time by negotiating with them. And I think what happened was that the word got out to the generals that he was negotiating with them, and it was pretty obvious what was going to happen to them if he did buy some time.
Before we go on to our next question, what's interesting that Dr. Jones is noticing, and the viewing audience may not realize, is in the audience tonight we have people who served in the Vietnam War, those who served on the president's staff during the war, as well as people who weren't even born when the war took place. So it's great how we get this variety of questions. Mr. Fuller, yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Lansdale went back into Vietnam, I believe.
Later he did.
Yeah, what was the occasion that he went back into Vietnam?
This was under Lyndon Johnson sometime afterward, but President Kennedy had called him in and surprised him in 1962 and asked him if he would head this task force on Cuba. And he was quite shocked by this, but then, of course, took it along with Robert Kennedy, and that was, of course, the whole Operation Mongoose affair.
Back to Arlington. Yes, sir.
From your presentation, I definitely got the impression that the Kennedy administration believed that New was the major problem with Diem's government. Was there ever any indication that Diem would remove New from power without being forced to, or was it clearly a matter of Diem goes with New?
What really was interesting was that even more than New, who infuriated the Kennedy administration, was Madame New. She got under the skin of these people so many times. There was one meeting, and I never found out who said this, but it was quoted in the back, to Diem, "Can't you shut up that woman?" She would criticize, and she was known as a dragon lady. She was the woman who wore the tight skirt that was slit up the side, and the reporter said it was like a dagger in a sheath, and that she was just pure, she was the Lucretia Borgia of the times and all of this. I mean, she said things that just cut them to the quick. And so not only was she there pushing New, then of course New had his VBI, his Vietnamese Bureau of Investigation, his hound dogs, his secret police, and all of this kind of thing. And they were operating the special forces who had been CIA trained, and they were the ones working with him as well. And then you've got Diem, who is not married, and Madame New is in effect the first lady for him during this time, and he can't control her. One time she told him to just simply shut up about your remarks about my clothing. She just simply would not listen to him as well. And so what the administration thought was the way to change things, and it made sense, get rid of the news. But Diem had gotten himself into the position where he trusted no one but family. And within his family, his closest confidants were his brother and his wife. And so there was no way he was going to remove them. He was his chief advisor on an unofficial level, but clearly his chief and closest confidant. So there was no way that was going to work out.
Time for two more questions. Carl.
I'd like to share this gentleman's skepticism and raise a counter-argument and see what your response would be. I have to paraphrase it, but I think people remember the remark, I believe it was in Kennedy's inaugural address, where he said something about in the preservation of freedom, we would, fight every battle. I think you know the quote. If he says something like that, he then participates in this coup, which maybe it didn't produce the result they thought, but nonetheless, it was very clear what our involvement was in this thing. And then things begin to disintegrate in Vietnam, as they did after this thing occurred. How could we then walk away from this? I mean, it would seem to me that the entire credibility of the U.S. government, not just in Vietnam, but credibility in general, would be demolished if something like this were to happen. If we just kind of did this. Well, how could we contemplate that if that's what happened? And we know that is what happened after this coup.
I know that the vital interest of the U.S. throughout this is what Dean Rush talked about, the credibility gap that developed later and so forth. But this is, again, before the Gulf of Tonkin. This is before all those events later on. And President Kennedy, I'm convinced, thought that we will cut it back to an advisory level. We'll try to hang on as long as we can there. And maybe that will work. And if it doesn't work, then we're going to have to just call it a wash. I know that doesn't fit. I know I've wrestled with that over and over, and I can't make it all come together yet in my mind. I know.
Would you comment on Maxwell Taylor's relationship with President Kennedy and his relationship with the other Joint Chiefs and how each affected his policy recommendations?
Well, Maxwell Taylor was, as far as I could tell, about the only general that President Kennedy liked. Curtis LeMay, he just simply couldn't be in the same room with him. In fact, Roswell Gilpatrick said about him that every time President Kennedy met with Curtis LeMay, he would come out and Kennedy would be in a fit. He couldn't speak. It was gibberish. He says, no civilized country can have a Curtis LeMay. He made that comment. Now, Maxwell Taylor, though, was different. Maxwell Taylor had written books. Maxwell Taylor had exalted the principle of flexible response in the dullest times, which, of course, made him very unpopular at that time. And after the Bay of Pigs fiasco, in which President Kennedy just not really wrote off the Joint Chiefs, not really wrote off the CA, but certainly determined that he was not going to listen to them first, just because they were experts. He was going to listen to others before. But in the aftermath of the Bay of Pigs, he invited Maxwell Taylor to come in and try to pick up the pieces and try to give us some direction on where to go in our foreign policy. And Taylor came in, and according to Kennedy's talks about him, he was handsome, he was intelligent, and he was not the typical martial kind of person. And he said that it was just like the aftermath of Verdun when he walked into the cabinet meeting. The morale was just rock bottom. And so he had to try to get them up. And Kennedy had him as his special advisor. And later on, of course, became the chair of the Joint Chiefs. But what is also interesting was that he became, as the days and weeks and months passed, an advocate of sending American combat troops. He was the one that was involved with Rostow in drawing up this plan of sending a logistical task force in to resolve the flood problems in the Mekong Delta. And this was a cover, there was no question, for bringing in around 8,000 to 10,000 American troops. And President Kennedy saw through that. And he said, I am not going to send combat troops into that country. That is like taking a drink. You take one, the effect wears off, and then you've got to have another, and it'll never end. So I'm not going to send the first combat troops in. Now, granted, he sent a lot of advisors. And yes, they fought a secret war. There's no question about that. But he also would not allow them to take the offensive, and as it turned out, he tried to turn the corner back.
Dr. Jones, final question. What's coming up next? What's your next book?
Well, I'm working on a book on the diplomacy of the Civil War for North Carolina.
Well, that's something to look forward to. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank Book TV. I want to thank you all for coming, and especially Dr. Jones.
Howard Jones is a history professor at the University of Alabama. Death of a Generation is published by Oxford University Press. Visit oup-usa.org for more information. Next week on him.
And led to Ziem's death rather than his exile. And yet, Had Kennedy lived to win re-election, there is no reason to believe that he would have changed his views about wanting to get out of a war that had become a lost cause. The story of this policy failure begins in the spring of 1962, when the apparent progress in the war encouraged the first talk of military reductions. At a high-level conference in Honolulu on July 23rd, General Paul Harkins, the ever-optimistic commander of the Military Assistance Command Vietnam, MACV, presented a glowing report on the war which heightened the move toward partial withdrawal. President Kennedy had instructed McNamara to devise a formula for implementing the process. The ensuing comprehensive plan for South Vietnam aimed at enabling the South Vietnamese government to police its own affairs, quote, without the need for continued U.S. special military assistance by the end of 1965. Not everyone shared this confidence. In late 1962, President Kennedy's longtime friend, Senator Mike Mansfield, submitted a dismal report on Vietnam and called for its neutralization. After Mansfield left a tense 2-hour meeting with the president at his Palm Beach retreat in Florida, Kennedy moaned to aide Kenneth O'Donnell, "I got angry with Mike for disagreeing with our policy so completely. And I got angry with myself because I found myself agreeing with him." The perceived progress in the war took another. He never called for a total withdrawal. Kennedy hoped that American assistance would improve South Vietnam's fighting performance to the extent that it could bring the insurgency under control. By the spring of 1962, he sought to roll back the U.S. military involvement to the less provocative advisory level he had inherited when taking office more than a year earlier. By the time of the president's assassination, he had come close to finalizing a process for withdrawing most of America's soldiers in accordance with the Comprehensive Plan for South Vietnam. The recently released Kennedy White House tapes show that both he and Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara had become convinced by the fall of 1963 that the United States should start the phased withdrawal. Once the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, ARVN, had pushed back the Viet Cong, and after Kennedy had won re-election in 1964, he would continue the withdrawal program aimed at having the great bulk of U.S. soldiers home in 1965. Those remaining behind would number 1,500, all advisors and well within the strictures of the Geneva Accords of 1954. This withdrawal effort stalled in the wake of the Buddhist uprising of May 1963 and ultimately came to a halt by the end of the year. What had happened in the meantime? In a tragically misguided move, President Kennedy followed Secretary of State Dean Russ's advice and
carry out your own research. So if you'd like to learn more about the National Archives, our programs, our records, ask me some questions. My information is in the program, or go to our website at archives.gov. Well, let's not stop anymore. How about I introduce to you Dr. Howard Jones. He comes all the way from Tuscaloosa, Alabama, and by the way, he received his PhD from the University of Indiana. It gives me great pleasure to introduce to you Howard Jones.
I thank you very much for coming out this evening, and I thank Sam for having me here at the National Archives. It's always a wonderful occasion to come to this place. If President John F. Kennedy had lived, he would not have sent combat troops to Vietnam, and America's longest war would never have occurred. So say Kennedy apologists. His assassination on November 22nd, 1963, they insist, had killed more than the president. It was responsible for the death of a generation, of more than 58,000 Americans, along with untold numbers of Vietnamese on both sides of the 17th parallel. When I began this study, I was dubious about these assertions, but as my research progressed, many of my doubts disappeared. President Kennedy had long regarded the war as South Vietnam's alone to win or lose, and made every effort short of direct U.S. combat involvement to turn the verdict in Saigon's favor. He staunchly resisted the relentless pressure for combat troops that came from both military and civilian advisors, but, critically important, promoted the general's coup in late 1963, thinking that a change of government would improve the war effort and thereby facilitate the U.S. withdrawal. Consequently, when the ARVN generals staged their coup in early November, they did so with full knowledge of American approval. South Vietnamese Premier Ngo Dinh Diem's crude handling of the Buddhist crisis had combined with the ARVN's bumbling war effort, the Kennedy administration's open criticisms of the regime, and the persistent rumors of Saigon's secret negotiations with Hanoi to drive the generals into a coup that culminated in the deaths of both Diem and his brother Ngo Dinh Nhu. The two assassinations opened a visceral division among the coup makers and led to renewed domestic turmoil. Then, in the short span of 3 weeks, President Kennedy himself lay dead, and with him, the comprehensive plan for South Vietnam. For good reason, historians are reluctant to speculate on what might have happened in Vietnam had President Kennedy lived. It is not speculation, however, to examine his policies toward Vietnam in an effort to discern whether or not a pattern of withdrawal was in the making. Kennedy sought to halt the move toward Americanizing the war in a process that President Richard Nixon would call Vietnamization. But so deep was the Kennedy administration's involvement in these events that it could not have escaped blame for the coup, regardless of what it did or did not do. Kennedy had encouraged a coup that got out of hand.
In Death of a Generation, history professor Howard Jones considers the impact that the assassinations of U.S. President Kennedy and South Vietnamese President Diem had on the Vietnam War. This History on Book TV feature from the National Archives in Washington, D.C. lasts an hour.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the National Archives. My name is Sam Anthony, and I'm your host for tonight's lecture and book signing. We are honored to have with us Dr. Howard Jones as he will discuss his book, Death of a Generation, How the Assassinations of Diem and JFK Prolonged the Vietnam War. Dr. Jones comes to us all the way from the University of Alabama. After teaching at the University of Nebraska for 2 years, he went to the University of Alabama in 1974, where he is now the University Research Professor of the Department of History, a recipient of both the John F. Burnham Distinguished Faculty Award for Teaching and Research and the Frederick Moody Blackman Sarah McCorkle Moody Award for bringing recognition to the university. He teaches courses in American foreign relations and the U.S.-Vietnam War. Dr. Jones has spent many an hour here at the National Archives and in the JFK Presidential Library and the LBJ Presidential Library researching this book. And you can do that too. The National Archives has billions of records, whether it be textual documents, photographs, motion pictures, and whether it was cited in this book or not, you can come here to the National Archives yourself